Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Rumi Forum. Today we have with us Rabbi Bruce Lustig. He is with the Washington Hebrew Congregation of Washington, D.C. It is the oldest Jewish congregation in D.C., I believe dating back to 1852. So we're very pleased to have him with us today. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Bruce Lustig. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. The setting is a little bit more formal than I'm used to, and we're going to try to do something that is really a traditional opportunity. One of the wonderful things that I've loved about my interaction with the Rumi Forum has been being able to interface with the individuals on a level that has exposed me to both the traditions and the thinking and the culture that comes along with this incredible forum. So what I would like to do is take an opportunity to introduce you to something that I know was very dear to the scholar Rumi, and that is the concept of service and the concept of giving to others. We, as the Jewish community, we approach a holiday this coming Friday, Thursday evening to Friday, called Shavuot, which is the Matan Torah, the giving of Torah. And one of the texts that we read in that is from the book of Deuteronomy. So what I would like to do with you today, if it doesn't interrupt the forum, we'll have a little bit of a dialogue before the actual dialogue takes place. And that is, I'd like to do some traditional text study with you and to look at some pieces in the Bible that are really the foundation of the understanding of where the Maimonidean philanthropic thrust of Judaism comes from. What the pillar that we know in Islam of charity and tzedakah, the idea of doing justly and doing right in the world, shares a very common root with the Judaism, and I'd like to explore that and to do that from some text. So you have three pieces of text in front of you. We're going to deal for sure with two of them. One of them starts out, it says, "Justice, justice you shall pursue." And it has bold letters Tanakh there. And what I'd like to do is to turn and we're going to read first in a little bit from the chapter 18 from our common ancestor Abraham. And one of these is that there's an interesting understanding as we look at Abraham, and we'll look at Abraham, and then we're going to look at a piece from Deuteronomy, and then we're going to look at a piece from Leviticus. And we're going to start with the individual, the common father Abraham, and look what in the dialogue that goes on with Abraham. Here we have in the book of Genesis chapter 18, and begin to explore how Abraham becomes the pillar, if you will, of setting forth in the dialogue and what's demanded of Abraham by God to the structure of what happens in terms of this opportunity that we have to participate with God in the work of social justice. So I'd hope that we would read this together, and perhaps it'll work and maybe the camera can turn it that way. But if you look if we're on page 2, there is Hebrew and English, and at certain times I'll do, and maybe Jenna,
yes,
if we can get you a copy, I'll ask you to do some of the reading as well, and then it won't be so monotonous.
Okay.
We start in, "And the Lord appeared to him by the tabernacle of Mamre as he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood over against him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed down to the earth and said, My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let now a little water be fetched, and wash your feet, and recline yourself under a tree." So here in this book right here, what do we already have from Abraham? A concept that we all are familiar with, but both within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the concept of hospitality. Abraham sees 3 strangers approaching, and his first indication is not to ask who they are or whatever, but to welcome them and to greet them. And he does. And even today, if you travel in the parts of the Middle East, you will hear the Bedouins do the same thing. They invite people in the desert by actually, as they grind their coffee and make a sound with it. People can hear it, and they'll follow the sound in order to come, and they know that they will be greeted. When I came into the Rumi Forum, what was I greeted with? A cup of good tea, and you know, over a cup of tea, we can solve the problems of the world and study and learn together. So Abraham has this sense of hospitality. And I will fetch a morsel of bread, stay ye your heart, and after ye shall pass on, for as much as ye came to your servant. And they said, do so, and thou hast said. Will you go ahead and read the next part? Sure. And Abraham hastened.
And Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes. And Abraham ran unto the herd, and fetched a calf tender and good, and gave it unto the servant, and he hastened to dress it. And he took curd and milk, and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat.
Very good. Now, anybody see anything that might be a little bit problematic about the text we just read? What do you think, Paul?
I'm wondering, isn't there a tradition about not mixing milk?
Absolutely. So here in a part of it is we have something that actually predates the concept of kashrut and the separation of milk and meat. And in this part of the hospitality, some of the rabbis would even explain away that he didn't cook necessarily for himself, but he might cook for others. But in part of this, what the question that I ask is, all the text when we do, and we study as Jews, we ask the question, mahakoshi, what's the difficulty? What's the challenge of the text? And here there's a challenge because we see something that goes counter to our understanding today of how we might deal with food. And continue on, and now we're going to find a story about how Isaac gets his name. Go on.
Okay. And they said unto him, where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, behold, in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee when the season cometh round, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard in the tent door which was behind him. And now Abraham and Sarah were old, and well stricken in age, and it had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women.
So she was past her prime of what we would know as childbearing time, and yet she's going to be that these 3 strangers that come, who are actually introduced in here as the strangers come, we're going to find that they're actually messengers of God. Go on.
And Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said unto Abraham, wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I of a surety bear a child, who am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the set time I will return unto thee, when the season cometh round, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, nay, but thou didst laugh. And the men rose up from thence, and took and looked out towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that which I am doing? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have known him, to the end that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, to the end that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him.
Now this part in 19 is very important. V'shamru derech Adonai, that they're going to guard the way of God. La'asot tzedek u'mishpat, that they should do tzedek, justice. It gets translated at times poorly into English as charity, but it's justice. It's the same root in Arabic in terms of it too, and it really means to make the world right, or to do something that is right. And mishpat is also in terms of judgments that should be done in part of it. So here we find, in a sense, is that the response is that Abraham is his first relationship is he's picked out because he's an individual who's going to do justly and he's going to do right. And part of this. And then we're going to find this episode with Sarah ends here. We know later that a child will be born to them. They're going to have Isaac, who is born Yitzhak, which comes from the root to laugh. And we know that subsequently There'll be we know as well that there's another son that'll be born, that is born to Abraham in the relationship in the time, Ishmael. And so in terms of this, from Abraham we find this incredible aptitude that comes in engaging in the world in the pursuit of what is right and what is just. And following this, we'll read quickly a story that we're all familiar with, which lays this out. So the first thing that the Bible does here, it calls that Abraham is going to be this man with these two verbs, mishpat, to do justly or to adjudicate properly and do what's right, and tzedek, to make the world right, which is going to be, which is the root that we have for tzedakah in Hebrew, and litzdok, to make the world right, to make the world just. So then we're going to have, and we have, that Abraham drew near, and wilt thou sweep away the righteous, because the men go, and there's a problem with Sodom, and Abraham begins a dialogue with God, and in that dialogue, he says that God says that we're going to wipe away the individuals of Sodom, and there are 50 righteous in the city. Wilt thou indeed sweep away and not forgive the place for the 50 righteous that are there? And following that, far be it from then, after this man, to slay the righteous. And we know that the next thing that we go on, and we have, he asked then what would happen if there were 30, and if there were 30, and what would happen if there were 40 or 30, and then even what if there were 10 righteous individuals. So in this text about Abraham, we have, in this microcosm of text, in one mere chapter, we're introduced to Abraham, an individual who has incredible hospitality, who sees individuals come, doesn't ask who they are, whatever, but welcomes them, their intent, feeds them, washes their feet, comforts them. Second of all, we have, in terms of in his relationship, that he's blessed in a sense that they are going to have, God tells them, a child that's going to come, and in addition, he feeds and dresses them, and engages is that the angels have a dialogue, the messengers have a dialogue with God, and says, should we say this? And God says that Abraham is an individual who will do righteousness and who will do justly. And then the following piece is we find that Abraham, even when God proclaims that the sins of Sodom are such that the people should be wiped out, Abraham wonders, what if there are 50 righteous? What if there are 30? What if there are 40? What if there are 10? And begs the question of, punishment to everyone. So this is a first introduction and an incredible pillar, because this text in Genesis 18:19, which is there, is a foundation of understanding what we do. I'm going to skip over, and we're going to look. Now, this next text is from Deuteronomy. It's from the very Torah portion that we will be reading on the giving of Shavuot. And it's going to begin to get into the idea of how do we implement that sense of justice and pursue justice, not just on an individual basis, but in a society. And the laws are laid out in terms of, at the end of every 7 years thou shalt make a release. I'm reading from chapter 15. And this is the manner of release. Every creditor shall release that which he hath lent unto his neighbor, and he shall not exact of it his neighbor and his brother, because Adonai released has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner thou mayest extract it, but whatsoever is thine with thy brother in thy hand you shall release. It shall be no needy among you. There shall be no needy among you, for Adonai will bless thee in the land, and God will give thee for the inheritance to possess it. And if thou diligently hearken to the voice of God, to observe, to do all the commandments which I command you on this day. For Adonai will bless thee as he has promised you, and thou shalt lead unto many nations, but thou shalt not borrow, and thou shalt rule over many nations, but shall not rule over thee. And here in 7, and if there among you needy man, one of thy brethren with any of thy gates in thy land which God hath given thee, thou shalt not harden thy heart, nor shut thy hand from the needy of your brother. Now we know this image of hardening the heart that is there. Where does that come from? We know in the paradigmatic story of freedom that comes out of the Exodus story, we know that the Pharaoh had an opportunity, but his heart is hardened, and there's a relationship that goes on in here. But surely, and here, ki patach tiftach et yadcha, that if thou shalt surely open thy hand unto him, thou shalt surely lend him sufficient what his needs and that which he wants. Beware that there is not a base though in thy heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release, is at hand, and thy eye be evil against thy needy brother, and thou shalt give him not, and he cry unto God against thee, and be ascended to thee. So it's warning you, even though we've put this system into place, don't misuse the system. Don't take advantage of someone knowing that the needy, that the year, the sabbatical year, the Shemitah, the sabbatical year is going to come. But here was a way that society had that within 7 years, all debts would be wiped out and people could get a fresh start. We should give the package to Obama. It's a real good stimulus package and gives us an opportunity to change things. Now, what goes on, it's very interesting in this. Thou shalt surely give him, and thy heart shall not be grieved when thou givest him, because that was what God will bless thee in thy work and in all that is put into hand. Now, this becomes a point where we could look at the text and say, is the text contradicting? Because it said that there's going to be no poor or needy in your hand, and now what does it say? For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command thee this day, thou shalt surely open thy hand unto the poor, and thy needy brother in the land. So in this text that we're giving, we are told that there always, first of all, that there's a system that we're going to have within our society, and how that in commerce and whatever, we're not going to indenture somebody so long that they cannot get out from under poverty. The good doctor is sitting here as an economist. I'm sure he could tell us that, you know, that in such a society would create cycles of poverty, which we know in modern society really is created. And here is a way. But what's very interesting is it reminds us that you're not to be frustrated. There are always going to be poor in your midst. Now, what's interesting is that this is a text in Deuteronomy, the codification of one of the most important things that happened. So this is the text that's read on Shavuot, the giving of Torah, Matan Torah. Now, I'm going to take you to a text that's read on our holiest day of the year. It's a text from Leviticus. It's Leviticus 19. It's one I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And then we're going to take a step forward and look at how one Jewish scholar looked at these particular texts. And it's a scholar that was not unfamiliar with Islam. In fact, spent a good portion of his life immersed in a community in Spain, an interaction in Spain with a community, and he leaves Spain and he lives in an almost completely Muslim world in both Morocco and then in Cairo, and Maimonides. And you'll probably teach me something about Maimonides. So we're looking here at Leviticus 19, the Holiness Code. And it says, and God spoke unto Moses, saying, speak unto the congregation of the children of Israel, and say unto them, ye shall be holy, for I am Adonai your God am holy. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the actions of humanity and what they do that has a direct reflection on God. And you shall, and every man and his mother, he shall keep my Sabbaths, for I am God, and you shall not worship idols, nor make yourselves molten gods, I am the Lord. And you shall offer sacrifices and peace offerings, in verse 5 and 6. It shall be eaten on the same day, and 7 on again. But as we skip down here, every man that eateth of it shall bear iniquity, and hath profaned the holy thing, and those who do not, their soul shall be cut off from his people. Now in 9, we're now going to talk about our laws of agriculture, the same where the Shnat Shemitah allowed us to give people in society an opportunity to reinvigorate themselves and not be trapped by poverty. Now our agricultural practices are also going to deal with this. So if we look at this, what happens? And you shall reap the harvest from your land, but not wholly reap. The corner of your field shall be you shall not gather the gleaning of the harvest. Thou shalt not glean the vineyard, neither shalt thou gather the fallen fruit of the vineyard, and you shall leave them for the poor and the stranger, for I am the Lord your God. And you shall not steal, and shall not deal falsely, and we're going to go through all these other things about this. But in this particular time, we're told a simple thing. When I glean my field, what is left of those fields? The very corners of the field, the fringes are left. And if I am picking fruit, what happens? If I drop fruit, I can't go back and pick it off the thing. Which meant that after a day of harvest, in the time that we're all living out, that without embarrassment, without being encumbered, somebody can walk through the many fields and find enough to eat. Imagine that if we had that type of a system in our community, in our society, in which we simply understood that a portion of what we had produced was to be left for those who are most in need, and did it in such a way that they didn't have to succumb to the lack of dignity that sometimes comes within our society, to be treated in such, to be treated different as a pauper. This was a way to allow people to be self-sufficient. The stranger, the widow, the poor, who had no opportunity for anyone else to have a voice for them, they had this opportunity. So in all of these things that follow, these are all the things. So even before we're told that you shouldn't bear falsely, that we shouldn't deal difficulty and injustice, all the things of Holiness Code, first it reminds that on a common level, not the lawyer, not the person who goes to the court, but the common man, every one of us who has a field, that we have a way of doing righteous and just by leaving the corners of our fields. Now, it's a fascinating piece, and what I'd like to do is to turn to a piece that I gave you. This was written by one of my colleagues who was at Washington Hebrew and now up in Boston. It's a piece called The Gifts for the Poor by Moses Maimonides, a treatise on tzedakah. And we're going to just look at a couple things. I've taken one of the pages of the introductory, and Maimonides went through and he created the opportunities for tzedakah, and he went and dealt with these laws. And I'd like you to look, and if we look here, that we begin in this piece, it says that in chapter 10, Maimonides describes the ethics of giving charity, so that the final chapter reads more like a sermon than a code of law. Within the chapter, he gives 4 philosophical rationale for why Jews should give charity. First, the reason that stands out is Maimonides' treatise on the poor is the integrity of one's lineage. Maimonides clearly states that giving tzedakah is the basic characteristic of the Jewish people, inherited directly from Abraham. Without this aspect of generosity and compassion, one's lineage becomes suspect. In other words, by not participating in the act of giving tzedakah and charity and doing righteously, it gives you suspect of who you really are and what your lineage is. And then it goes on this, but one thing I want to draw to your attention, if you'll look on the turnover one page, and it has, we're going to have, and it's on page what is equivalent of XVII, the 7. You'll see one expert levels of Maimonides and other Jewish scholars understood that there were levels and degrees of aid, so that there were levels and degree of need. It's noteworthy, perhaps not coincidental, that Maimonides identified 8 levels of tzedakah, while rabbinic interpretation notes that biblical Hebrew has 8 words to denote the poor. Now, there's a great correlation. If you look at the note, Jenna, will you read the note there? An obvious question, note 14. I thought this was fascinating.
An obvious question is, why does Maimonides claim that there are 8 levels of giving and not some other number? While it would be premature to come to a definite conclusion, for the number could reflect personal inspiration. Another possibility suggests itself from the Muslim world in which Maimonides lived. As reflected in the Islamic Code of Law, The Reliance of the Traveler by Ahmed ibn Naqib al-Misri, who lived in Cairo a century after Maimonides lived, but who codified law that was in existence during Maimonides' time. We see that there are 8 groups of people who are worthy to receive zakat. that is, charity incumbent upon Muslims and one of the 5 pillars of Islam. See Ahmed ibn Naqib al-Misri, Reliance of the Traveler, translated by Nu Ha-Mim Keller. The poor are divided according to Muslim law into 8 categories of recipients who qualify to benefit from charity collected by the Muslim community. While the only connection between the 2 codes of law appears to be the number 8 and the subject of charity, it is entirely possible that Maimonides, well aware of the basic practices of the Muslim world around him, may have found his inspiration from the Muslim community. Maimonides' relationship to the Muslim community and its impact on his writing is well known in terms of his philosophy, but still needs to be investigated in terms of his theory of law.
Very good. So there's a direct relationship. Now I'd like you to turn over. If you keep going, you'll get to a point, and I think that this next point, and then we'll open it up for discussion. What is clear is that Maimonides is, in living in the world, lives in a society, both with Christians and Muslims, that has an absolute respect and a way of engaging the poor. Very different than our modern society today. And so this concept that we have today to look at is that what do our ancient texts and the legacy that has been bequeathed to us by Abraham beg of us today in terms of dealing with how we approach our understanding of dealing with tzedakah. Maimonides clearly is very concerned about the dignity of the individual. And he has subtle ways of dealing with this. If you turn over to this page 3, there's an introductory note. It's the note that says Laws on the Gift of the Poor, Chapter 1. And there's an introductory note that I would like to share with you. And it's consolidated by Rabbi Mesler, and Joseph did such a great job of this. He's to be commended. The chapter provides an overview of the biblical laws of agricultural gifts to the poor, certainly the ones we just read about in Leviticus. Maimonides begins this introductory chapter defining produce and designates for the poor in a general fashion, and he provides more technical definitions further as on each kind of produce is taken up in turn. Also described here the process, positive, negative mitzvot, alluded to in the previous list of relevant commands and topics gift for the poor. Specifically are the commandments that if the owner of a field transgresses the prohibition against gathering certain kinds of produce, he may still escape liability by giving from other areas of produce, often to his increased costs. Now, here's the point that's great. This is beautiful. The names of the gifts for the poor given by the rabbis of the Talmud offer psychological insight to the nature of poverty. They include peah, indicating the edge of the field; laket, the overlooked gleanings; peret, the separated fruit, principally of grapes; oliot, the malformed grape clustered; and the shekhinah, the forgotten sheaf of the field. It is perhaps no coincidence that the names of the produce given to the poor allude to the kind of people who happen to be commonly poor, those living on the edge of society, the overlooked, the separated, frequently the malformed, and often the forgotten. The names of the produce for the poor remind the giver of the marginalized members of the community. So the idea is that even in the simple task, when you see a piece of fruit that's malformed, you're not to take it. It's left there for somebody else to do, reminding us that we treat things that are in a different way. Maimonides goes on to something I think is so incumbent upon all of us. He talks in his levels of this about the dignity that's to be given to the individual. And of course, the greatest idea of giving tzedakah is to empower somebody with the opportunity to help themselves. So how does this translate out? In my congregation, and what I do is one of my favorite statements that's in I gave you a whole group of statements from a beautiful book called The Voice of Wisdom. One of my favorite things is that it's a Hasidic statement saying that you don't reach down into the mud from above to pull a man out of mud. What do? You go down yourself, get in the mud, put your arms around the man, and bring both of you out into the light. The concept there is that the absolute respect and dignity that's been given to the individual who is poor is like we should give to royalty. And this comes from the father Abraham, who instills in the teachings in both Islam, in Christianity, and in Judaism about the dignity and worth of every human being. So this is a simple taste of textual studies. We find in just one chapter in Genesis, we find this incredible statement about Abraham, his sense of hospitality, the fact that he was a righteous individual, and his reaching out. And even in a common thing, when these people are going and Sodom and Gomorrah are supposed to be destroyed, he argues, engages with God and says, what if? You can't, what if there's one righteous person there? Which gives us a standard of justice that we have to do. And then we find in the book of Deuteronomy this concept where in this we talk about all of the things that there's always going to be poor and needy, but give your hand openly. You shouldn't close your hand and you shouldn't give with a tight fist, but to give openly. And no matter what you do, you can't be frustrated. There are always going to be poor amongst you. And this is a level. And last, even in the book of Leviticus, in the simple things, before we even talk about how we become holy, when we even do the simple agricultural text of gleaning from our fields, and Maimonides goes on and says, these are done in such a way to remind us. So these are texts. These are interesting texts. I want to open it up now because I think I've taken my allotted 20 to 30 minutes and allow you to ask questions about the text and to see how they do. Yes, sir. He's got a microphone for you.
Rabbi? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
My name is Zamin, and I come from Jewish heritage also.
Wonderful.
And also work with people that are in poverty. There's a part of me that doesn't like the word the poor.
Right.
Because in some ways it paints people with their economic status and in a way maintains a caste and keeps us above people. And I wonder too, I think that there's a tradition of giving charity, which is a wonderful thing.
Mm-hmm.
But charity in some ways enables one group of people to feel above another group instead of breaking open the granaries and equalizing the water. So it may be a social justice question. How do we get from the point, in your view, in our tradition, from ownership, from possessiveness, to sharing the wealth and giving up status? Now, I think one of the great dividers in life is status, and wealth equates to status. It equates to welcome. If you have your MasterCard, you're welcomed into the restaurant. If you come bedraggled, you're not. How do we break down those barriers to welcoming so it's just not a kindness to the poor people, but we are actually creating a condition that releases our possession? I think the last thing I'll say is there's a line from the Christian scriptures, and someone says to Jesus, I want to follow the spiritual path. What do I do, Master? And he says, take everything you own, and he says, give it to the poor. He says, give it away. How do we get to that point in a real world where if you give it away, you may find yourself poor? But how do we address the causes of poverty and not just the symptoms and really become alters of the social condition?
Well, I think it's an excellent question on lots of levels, and I agree. In the text, though, it is very clear that, you know, Maimonides, and we didn't go into dealing with the dignity of the poor, addresses exactly what your question is about, because I think that we have created this, and unfortunately it's a European model that was handed down and is very different than the model of the Jewish community over time, which is the hands-down charity. And that's why the story that I said about the Hasidic getting down into the mud and doing it is very much where what I think the way we break that is the way that we've inculcated our children today. And I can only speak about my own congregation, and I can't speak for all of Judaism or all of society. I wish I certainly could, but I'm limited to a small group of people on Massachusetts Avenue. The reality is the way we've challenged that is that in our congregation, I started a program years ago that's called Mitzvah Day. It's now done all over the country. It is a day in which we do community service work. And traditionally, it is a day where I won't sign for children community service credits. And in my congregation, it's translated because I believe that people come to do that work not because they're going to get credit for it, because it's part of what is part of their character and what they want to do to make the world better. Now, the common root for what gets called by English charity, which is a very poor translation of Sadat, if I'm pronouncing the Arabic is pronounced
Sadaqah.
Sadaqah, and for us, tzedakah, that word really means making right more than it means charity. It's a poor thing because it really connotates action in the world. And so the answer to that is if we take from the very beginnings, is that we see that every human being is created. And in Jewish tradition and often in Islam, you know, our burial is very simple. Our hands are open, we're cleansed, we're washed, we're all taught, treated in the same dignity, no matter how much we had or how much we didn't have. And our attempt in this world is to do things where we preserve the dignity and we understand. And so I believe the best way of doing that is from the bottom up, and that's starting with our children and inculcating into them that that everybody has certain inalienable rights that are part of our Constitution, and those inalienable rights are to a dignity and ability to be able to eat and have shelter and have love and warmth from our community. I have 120 children that become B'nai Mitzvah every year, that they come and they read from the Torah. Every one of those students voluntarily does a mitzvah project where they go out. And those are from working, you know, a work project that instead of doing a project, they'll work with Avodah here in our community, doing a building of a home or a ramp for a family that needs to do, has a handicapped or a challenged individual that needs to have access, or providing books to a inner city school. These are all programs, and we don't want, in my part of it, I don't allow the children to just pass funds on. I believe, and I don't like them, I often talk to them about not regifting, meaning that if somebody gives me a check in my celebration, I shouldn't just pass that on. But they can use that as capital to raise some money for themselves in order for the fact that they have earned and that they're giving of their own funds. And so what often these kids have done is they've collected books in the neighborhood, and they'll have a book sale. They'll do a bake sale. And what they do is that we encourage them to go to the place and be there and to share those gifts, to cook a meal at a shelter, to buy the clothing and show up with the clothing, so that there's not this luxury distance. Because what you described, sir, is so true. Just like we've got food that's wrapped in cellophane and put in cans, you know, and there's a distance between feeling and touching our food, so our society has also created a distance and a buffer between other human beings that are of our need.
We'll just ask another.
Sure, there's a...
It's like in a capitalist system, you know, charity, which is the bedfellow of a capitalist system, always maintains an elite versus the communalist tradition. I even think in Islam, the original Ummah, I mean, it didn't have all these classes in it. It was much more down to earth. Now, granted, we're a much more complex society, but is it not our work to, I don't want to say work in opposition to it, but we've got to have a counterpoint to that in some fashion, where we just keep reseeding the soil with the same plant that puts out all of these awful symptoms. Or
we do what the biblical text that we've shown, that's thousands of years old, is it built into a system, is that it doesn't say that wealth is bad and that making a living is bad, but it inculcates into one and builds into the system a situation in which one can't become interminably impoverished, because the Shanat Shemitah allows a person to be released from debt. And second of all, it builds into the very essence of gathering the food before you can even eat it. Before you can even decide, it's already built into society that a portion of that has to go for the other people. And so these are ways that we can have, if you will, our cake and eat it too. Or everybody can have cake and they can all eat from the same thing. But these are wonderful questions. Yes, sir.
Ermal Hitay, graduate student, University of Maryland and IMF. So my question was, well, a common question. Actually, I had a couple.
Okay.
If we look at the laws on gifts for the poor,
yes,
from Maimonides, it doesn't sound like a theoretical description of what we do, but it's pretty practical, right?
It's very.
Now that bears the deduction. He is talking about the Jewish community that owns land and produces agricultural output. And it strikes one that one could deduce from this that the Sephardic community had a much more complete social and economic life than the Ashkenazi community, because it seems here that, and we know that the Ashkenazi community was typically they did not own land; they were more concentrated on trade and so on. And actually, this was my idea about the Sephardic community as well. But from what Maimonides is saying here, it appears not to be the case. You know, what do you think about the second one?
Well, let me answer one at a time, just so I remember. I think that you have to remember that Maimonides is responding to a much older text that is actually responding to the text that's a biblical text. So in Judaism, there's a concept that there's first called Doraita, which means from the text, meaning from the Bible, and then there's Darabanan, which is from the rabbis. And so there's, just like that there's a hierarchical position in terms of the fact even in Islam, in the study of the law, there is that earlier law, and then we comment on it. So Maimonides is actually codifying, he's going through and making sense of and pulling together a rabbinic text, which is commentaries on the biblical text. So that deduction is not necessarily a true reflection in what he's writing about the society in which he lives in. There were times when these laws were applicable where the Jews were absolutely an agrarian culture. As we move further in time, sometimes not to their own doing, but for the laws that were placed upon them by the various cultures that came into power, they were prevented from participating in the agricultural aspect. And so there are ways in which those same concepts are then played out into society. For example, there's something where there's the community kuppah, which is we all give a certain amount of charity in. So instead of gleaning from our fields, we glean from our income or what we do and provide so that the community could then give. But what he does clearly express in this, and when he brings out is, I think he is making a comment that is a fair deduction, which Rabbi Messler did in the beginning of his comment. As the first man recognized, Maimonides himself did recognize that the poor in society were separated in such a way that it played upon their dignity. And so his comment of even bringing forth and talking about the names of these things and the fringes of society and what the rabbis did, we know that this has been done for a long time. And the Bible even lets us know that here we have a clear understanding that in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus that we have a clear understanding of free will, because God lets us know that there's an opportunity for us to have a just society, but we have to be partners in that society. Your second question, I hope that answered.
If anybody would have another question. So the second question might actually be even more abstract and hard to deal with, but it's something that I've been thinking for a long time.
Sure.
If we look in the 19th century, in the beginning of the modern social democracy in Germany, a lot of the intellectuals associated with the Social Democrats would be of Jewish parentage. Now, you know, starting with Rosa Luxemburg and whatnot, they would be quick to dissociate themselves from that, and they were all seculars, and they had a nice Marxist strand to them and all that. But the question in my mind has always been, well, how much can one attribute their progressivism in economic and social terms to the fact that they came from an oppressed portion of the society, and how much could, or what part of that could that be attributed actually to the Jewish culture and to the Jewish teachings that they must have gotten in
Sure.
some way through their family and entourage?
Well, I mean, it's a wonderful question. If I could answer the question of nature versus nurture, you know, I wouldn't be sitting here, but would be in a whole different category on a level. But it's clear that all of these individuals and the desire even to assimilate is a very difficult thing, and it's something that we understand early on, because as even in the time that Joseph, the biblical ancestor Joseph, is in Egypt, you know, he is known to his fellows in terms of it, and he has acculturated in a sense, and the Jew has always had this interrelationship between the society and culture what they live in and the ability to maintain their own personal identity. This is what Maimonides struggles with and why we codify this law, because as Jews were part of the diaspora and went all over the world, this idea of how to fulfill the Maimonidean philanthropic impulse was incumbent upon them no matter what culture they lived in. I'm sure, you know, if we looked at Mendelssohn and others, you know, there's the famous story of Franz Rosenzweig, who believes that he can only ultimately become who he wants by converting to Christianity. He believes that he has to become part of the whole and the greater whole in order to live out and fulfill his things. So he goes to a service and he says, I'm going to leave Judaism the way through beings, and he goes to rid himself of his sin on Kol Nidre. He's so moved by the experience that he actually turns all of his efforts towards Judaism and becomes a, you know, this great Jewish thinker. In 1913 he writes The Star of Redemption from a foxhole and sends it back to his wife, and you know, he creates this idea of the relationship between God, Torah, and Israel, and this tension that goes on. So, you know, like Islam and like Judaism and like Christianity, the greatest thinkers in any of these do not ignore the society in which they live in, nor the gifts that were given to me. As a rabbi, I would be a fool if I ignored the wisdom and beauty that is offered to me by Islam. I would be a fool to ignore the wisdom and beauty that is offered to me by Christianity, and also those things that come to us from a secular culture. And I do those. And true intellectualism means that we are sure enough about our own identity that we can engage and not feel threatened by those. Now I should worry the economist will speak.
I will not speak as an economist at all. The interesting thing is that if we look at the Jewish history, I think Jews or Jewish groups in the world lived more as a minority than as an independent society. And there had to be some sort of social cohesion among them and social help. The little that I know, and what I know only refers to Salonika, when the Jews were kicked out of Spain, thanks to stupidity of Fernando and Isabella, they settled. A majority of them, they settled in Salonika. And there was tremendous cohesion and help between the rich and the poor, the understanding and so on. And this, of course, comes from the Bible. That certainly what you just read reads like a poetry, which is very enjoyable, but at the same time, it might have been forgotten had the total Jewish population in the world had converted into location X and lived as an independent state. It would be different now in Israel, which I don't think is very different than any other place that you referred as a capitalistic society. The tradition of the Bible, as Ermal suggested, really carries all the way through the Enlightenment period of France, and later on the utopian socialists, the Blanquis and the Saint-Simons and so on and so forth, until of course Marx come along. Those, especially the French socialists, utopian socialists, were not Jewish. It's very interesting that from Marx onwards, many of them were Jewish, and again they were minority in Germany and they were minority in Russia. The upshot of the story is that Maimonides, especially living in the Muslim areas, is it, by the way, true that to a certain period he converted into Muslim and converted back?
I'm not aware of that.
I've read this someplace, I cannot find it. Anyway, He was a great, I mean, he wrote, a guide to the perplexed about faith and so on and so forth, and he wrote a treatise of medicine and so on and so forth. And his perception, of course, shows perhaps the Islam on his thinking as well. So the tradition of helping the poor perhaps started with the Bible, perhaps even earlier than that, but certainly penetrated to all European culture, let's call it European culture, as well as the Middle East and the Muslim culture. It is true that we have to help our brethren, but it's even more true that we should help them in such a way that it does not hurt their pride and their dignity as a human being. So I think what you just read from the Deuteronomy, I think should be read over and over again. Thanks.
Thank you. I believe you're referring to in 1148 there was a demand of the entire Jewish community that they convert to Islam or receive death, and so there were a whole group that, and his family is part of that, but I don't believe that such a governmental decree in that level reflects a conversion of the heart or of the spirit in that level. I think that the two questions are, were in both senses that I would tend to differ and tell you that I believe that the philanthropic thrust, this idea of the pursuit of justice, this idea of making the world right, this idea that is so core to being Jewish as part of tzedek, tzedek, tirdov, justice, justice you shall pursue, which we find in Deuteronomy, is so core to the part of the essence of Judaism that whether we were a majority or whether we were a minority, whether we have assimilated or not, it finds its way into the work and world. It's part of the essence of the Jew. And so that's why I think you will find that the individual who grows up in a Jewish home and becomes the greatest secularist, or the Jew that becomes the greatest Talmud scholar or whatever, they share a common thread, which is this understanding that we are partners in the world. The last comment that I'll give you is that there's a piece that comes out of Sfat. Rabbi Luria talks about the idea that at the creation of the world, that all the light in the world was put in these vessels. And the vessels were so tight and so that they burst. And these fragments of creation went everywhere. And the concept in Judaism called tikkun olam, the idea is that our responsibility is we're partners with God because we have to each go and take those little fragments and help bring it back to repair the world. I see that beauty in the writing of Rumi. I see that beauty in the interface what I have with people in the Rumi forum, because my brothers and sisters of Islam who I've been introduced through Rumi forums and through their activities are ones who continually work in the world to collect those sparks by doing righteousness, by creating interfaith dialogue, by creating opportunities where we can all become the real children of Abraham and the children of one God who looks and understands that we're all created in the image of God. And I believe that this is a great opportunity. I want to thank you for this opportunity. Thank you. And I hope that we had a little learning, and I enjoyed the opportunity.
Thank you for coming and being with us today. And I have a couple things that I want to say.
Sure.
Zamin had made a comment, and I think that on the few occasions that I had visited Washington Hebrew Congregation, and I have seen Rabbi Lustig in action, I have been most impressed. I think that, our actions speak louder than words, maybe not louder than our text, but they speak louder than words in many cases. And so there were two occasions. We cooperated with the Washington Hebrew Congregation for the Whirling Dervish event.
Gorgeous.
Yes, it was a wonderful event. And there was a young man there, and now I think the Washington Hebrew congregation is a very diverse community. At the same time, there is I think some members of the community that are in a very affluent situation, and I think but there was a member of the congregation. He was a young man, and I believe he's most likely, I would guess, I've worked with this community before, mentally ill. And he was having a tough time, and he was having a tough time maybe with the fact there were so many people there, and Rabbi Lustig, in the midst of it all, and everyone is there and watching this interaction, goes and tries to calm this young man. And I think this is really important, because instead of saying to somebody, yeah, can you please go and keep him quiet? Yeah, you went and you did that yourself. And I think that was just such a wonderful thing to witness. Secondly, I was just there a couple weeks ago at Washington Hebrew, and we had a 20,000 Dialogues UPF movie and dialogue. I went to speak with you about your talk here today, and you were taking some chairs out of the this is a really massive community. You all should visit this place if you haven't yet. Washington Hebrew Congregation is a beautiful building, and it's amazing history, and it's a huge congregation. And Rabbi Lustig is, taking the chairs out of storage for people to come sit. He's, and anyway, so I think this is what we need to see from our leaders. And I think that going back to, the poor and having an elitist mentality, or, thinking, just giving just to give, but thinking still that those people are down there. But I think that Rabbi Lustig has really shown and acted upon the text that we read today, and I think this is very important for your community, the young people, and everyone to see, and step by step, if we can live this out and do what the prophet Abraham alayhi salam did, hopefully we can do that. So thank you so much for coming today and being with us.
Thanks for the opportunity.